Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is a captivating novel about a seemingly innocent girl who marries a widower with a terrible secret. Classic Gothic romance. Except du Maurier hated the idea of her book being a romance, and the readers kind of hated the idea of the story being anything else. But what even is a Gothic romance? And why do women like them so much if, as many people say, these stories disguise violence as love? Can they really be a safe space for the exploration of darker themes? Look, Rebecca is not a new book. It was published in 1938, but it is still very popular to this day. I actually found out about it because it was recommended many times on BookTok. But it continues to be controversial because it is an excellent story that represents the entanglement of love and violence without an overly explicit moral perspective. But why have these types of books always created such a scandal? And how can a single story generate almost opposite interpretations? Let's have a look at their history. Dark love. As I mentioned in my last video, critics and the general public have always been concerned about what women read. Historically, we have been considered sensible and highly impressionable, and thus, every now and then, a moral panic resurges regarding the content of what women read on their own. You know, it might give us weird ideas like a desire for love, respect, and independence. And worse, what if the books women are reading are not so much about butterflies in the stomach and swooning over a gentleman, but rather about mysterious and possibly murderous males and morally questionable protagonists? How would that impact women's minds? Well, the Gothic genre, and particularly Gothic romances, are well known for these types of stories. In the article Gothic Repetition, Michelle Massey defines the classic plot of this genre as a terror-inflicted variant of courtship narrative in which an unprotected young female in an isolated setting uncovers a sinister secret. Massey distinguishes between two main types of Gothic romances. The earlier form, exemplified by Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, portrays a young woman confronted by terrifying situations, but the story resolves by restoring social order through marriage. A later variation, which Massey calls marital Gothic, reverses this pattern. The terror begins only after the protagonist marries. Both of them revolve around feminine concerns. First, the fear of not marrying, of ending up a spinster. The second type represents the opposite, the fear of marriage, the idea that submitting to a man might mean losing our identity, or that we might be trapped with an unknown, unpredictable, and possibly violent person. But these stories aren't just classics disconnected from current social issues. In the article, Somebody's Trying to Kill Me and I Think It's My Husband, that's such a funny name, Joanna Russ observes that in the 20th century, the modern Gothic emerged. These books were based on similar concerns and created alternative worlds that allowed their main audience, middle-class housewives, to project their fantasies and worries. And I believe this might continue today in what is known as dark romance. Although I'm no expert because I'm not really drawn to this subgenre, mainly because of the writing style, I find it fascinating how it's still really controversial that women like to read love stories that involve darker themes. Because what if these violent situations were presented in a critical perspective? Well, I would like to explore a novel that was highly misunderstood in its time and offers valuable insight into how critics and readers relate to a romance book filled with morally obscure characters. Rebecca, Fantasy and Projection. I want to clarify that this will be an analysis of the plot and other elements, so there will be spoilers. And the interest of this novel is heavily based on its argument and twists, so you are warned. When Rebecca was first published, it was simply considered to be an exquisite love story. For example, the Sunday Times described this novel as a romance in the grand tradition. Other critics consider it a mere page-turner, only aimed to entertain its readers. I'll summarize the argument in case you haven't read the novel or you don't remember the details. The protagonist is a working-class girl with a basic education. We never know her name, which signals her identity issues. At the beginning of the novel, she works as a companion for an American lady in Monte Carlo, where she meets a wealthy man, Maxim de Winter. He's an older widower who casts a spell on the protagonist, and shortly after meeting her, he proposes, presenting the possibility of a luxurious life that would have been completely unattainable for the protagonist otherwise. Of course, they get married and they move to Maxim's manor, Manderley. The first important element of this novel that can lead to misinterpretation is the protagonist herself. She's a young, plain, apparently innocent girl whom readers can project themselves into, because she appears to be living a common fantasy, to be rescued from her tedious life by a wealthy and attractive man. This was like the 20th century version of those fanfics in which the protagonist's name is ... So you, the reader, can insert your own name and can be like, yes, I am dating a moody millionaire who looks like Harry Styles. However, I don't think du Maurier's intention was for readers to simply identify with the protagonist. But we need to move further along the plot to understand that. Life in Manderley isn't exactly what the protagonist wished for. Although the mansion is beautiful, she quickly realizes that she can't fulfill the role of mistress of the house. This was mainly because she was a working-class girl, lacking the cultural capital an upper-class lady would have. And there was someone who had all of that. Rebecca, the late wife of Mr. De Winter. Everyone and everything reminds the protagonist that she'll never be as beautiful, smart, and sociable as Rebecca was. Mrs. Danvers, the head housekeeper at Manderley, who had a very special bond with Rebecca, makes it very clear that the new Mrs. De Winter will never fill the void left by the late Mrs. De Winter. When analyzing the modern Gothic, Joanna Russ notes that there's always another woman who is at the same time the heroine's double and her opposite. Very often, the other woman is the super male's present wife or dead first wife. But why is this so common? Well, for once, the Gothic is not the pure escapist fantasy it's made to be. The genre addresses social and cultural issues, particularly those affecting women, and dramatizes them. The creation of an antagonist for the bland protagonist allows the exploration of models of femininity and women's struggles to fulfill these expectations. But these perfect women are usually the heroine's doubles as well. This means that there are elements that unite or mirror them. In this case, both of them are Mrs. De Winter. Basically, they're the two sides of the same coin. But there are many more elements that show how this novel was never meant to be a simple romance. Confessions, justifications, and interpretations. From the moment the protagonist sets foot in Manderley, it is clear that those walls are hiding secrets. And when the protagonist is on the verge of madness, Maxim breaks instead. And he confesses that Rebecca didn't die. He killed her. Okay, so this is the point where you would expect the protagonist to flee Manderley, maybe England altogether, and never see Maxim again. I mean, she just found out that her husband murdered his previous wife, so that kind of puts her in danger, right? Wrong, because this is the point when du Maurier subverts expectations, creating, to me, what is the best twist of the novel, even better than the revelation of Maxim's crime. As soon as Maxim confesses, he tells the protagonist for the first time that he loves her. So, is she scared? Is she disgusted? No, she's ecstatic. I found this scene almost funny because of its shock value. The protagonist isn't concerned for her own life. She's basically screaming, "He picked me, he chose me, he loves me. Look, at first, she is impacted by the news, but she's mostly worried for him. She tells Maxim, I love you more than anything in the world. We can't lose each other now. We've got to be together always, with no secrets, no shadows. Please, darling, please. So the murder confession turns into a love confession. So finally, they can rejoice in their love and live happily ever after. Except he killed his wife. We modern readers, woke feminists, might wonder how early readers interpreted this as a love story. In the afterword to this novel, Sully Beauman writes, one way of reading Rebecca is as a convention-written love story, in which the good woman triumphs over the bad by winning a man's love. This version is the one our nameless narrator would have us accept, and it is undoubtedly the reading that made Rebecca a bestseller. But why is she referring to Rebecca as the bad woman when so far she's been presented as the face of perfection? Well, alongside Maxim's confession comes his justification. Rebecca wasn't the ideal lady the world believed her to be. Maxim reveals that shortly after marrying, she confessed she was a perverted, promiscuous woman. In 1938, when this book was published, it wasn't uncommon to think that unfaithful women deserved severe punishment. However, Maxim's actions were still controversial, as it is proven by Hitchcock's adaptation. In this movie, Maxim doesn't kill Rebecca. Instead, she falls during a discussion, which causes a deadly injury. This change in the plotline alleviates Maxim of the responsibility, but it also relieves the protagonist and the public of the moral burden of rooting for a criminal. Additionally, there was a fear of misinterpretation. What if the public didn't understand that representation doesn't mean endorsement? I also wonder if they changed the scene because they were scared of moral judgment or simply because they wanted to lean into a more traditional love story. Love story or not, alternative interpretations have only become prominent in recent decades, but don't believe these are forced feminist analyses. Daphne du Maurier was never happy when people labeled her novel as a romance, and she established that one of the main points of the story was the study of jealousy, shifting the focus to the relationship between the female antagonists rather than the love story. In this sense, in an essay about redefining the Gothic romance, Holly Hirst notes, the critical emphasis on the romance between a brute and an ingenue obscures the centrality of a variety of female interrelations. These relationships are frequently the principal focus of the novel, the heroine's journey, and the source of threat. Many more elements in this book stand against the interpretation of it as a conventional love story. The problem is, most of them aren't tremendously explicit. There isn't an omniscient narrator telling the reader, Maxim is a criminal, his new wife is complicit, and Rebecca, although a hypocrite, is still a victim. But what elements actually dismantle the reading of Rebecca as a typical romance? Well, for example, perspective. We only hear Maxim's side of the story, and most importantly, this is retold from the protagonist's point of view, and she's in love with him, so she is very biased. Some critics even think that we could consider the narrator to be unreliable. In the deceptively strategic narrator of Rebecca, Harriet Kramer Lincoln establishes, like all first-person or internally focalized narrators, she filters the details of her story. Moreover, as she produces her confessional memoir, she engages in paralipsis, or omission, to to exonerate her questionable actions in Monte Carlo, in Manderley, and in Exile. And if you read the novel, you'll know that there are a lot more elements that allow us to question the interpretation of this book as a love story in which Rebecca is only a wicked obstacle between the protagonist and Mr. De Winter. However, often readers ignore the clues that indicate the meaning of a story, and they read superficially, only focusing on the plot and the main traits of the characters. And this, of course, is not an issue exclusive to this book. Critical reading of relationships. Look, I get it. Sometimes we all want to immerse ourselves in a story that makes us feel good without thinking too much about it. However, reading is an intellectual activity, and it is fundamental to engage critically with the material we're reading, especially with these genres that represent darker themes. In Identification, Affect, and Escape, Theorizing Popular Romance Reading, Stephanie Moody observes how women, the main audience of romance novels, treat reading as an emotional activity, desiring to be absorbed and carried away by fiction. She writes, "This finding is unsurprising given the content of romance novels and their cultural status as pleasure reading. Romances foreground romantic relationships, position readers to experience these relationships intimately, and are generally read for purposes of relaxation and escape." Stephanie interviewed romance readers and found that they didn't read in what we typically consider a critical manner. Returning to Rebecca, this novel was never meant to be a simple romance, but readers, particularly early readers, were predisposed to that interpretation by reviews and the editorial market. In general, I think uncritical reading and incorrect marketing might be a central factor in the misinterpretation of romances that include darker themes, which are read as an endorsement when they might be a critique, as it happened with Rebecca. Additionally, I don't believe enjoyment and critical thinking are contradictory. We can enjoy a romance novel while still engaging critically with it, and I would say the experience is even better than if we read it superficially. Conclusion. I think we shouldn't be so scared of fiction that portrays the darker aspects of love. Often, these stories provide valuable insights when read critically, but there's also responsibility on the author's part. To create a complex and nuanced story, a writer needs a certain level of awareness and maturity. And for sure, there are many Gothic romances or dark romances that are poorly written glorifications of violence. Many times, those are created by less talented authors who aren't even aware of the reasons for writing obscure love stories. I hope you enjoyed this video about Rebecca. Please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for your time.